Thanks very much, Natalie, and a warm welcome to everybody who's joining us for this follow-up talk from Sean Kelly, who was with us about 10 days ago. And he's very kindly agreed to give a more formal presentation on this occasion. The presentation last time and the event was more informal, and it suffered from my sort of dropping out at one point from my daughter's flat in Scotland. The internet just disappeared completely. So we had a few problems. And in the meantime, I've managed to read Sean's book, which is Becoming Gaia on the Threshold of Planetary Initiation. And I think those of you who are regulars at our webinars will see there's this emerging theme from the year, about ethical decisions, interconnectedness, interdependence, planetary consciousness, global consciousness, and how, if at all, we are really able to make a sufficiently profound shift to face up to the evolutionary challenges that we have actually set ourselves. Although there's a kind of overall dynamic to this as well. So this is slightly different in format. We're not going to have a break. And so we've got an hour and a half, an hour and 25 minutes now. So Sean's going to give his presentation, and then we'll go straight into questions. And I'll just make some brief announcements at the end. Sean.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be back with you. I have a lot of images to share with you today, actually, and not too many people have seen these. They focus, my presentation today is definitely drawing from my book, Becoming Gaia, but particularly I'll be drawing from chapter 5, the paradox of planetary initiation. But I want to share my screen with you here for a second. And I don't know, Natalie, I keep getting, maybe it'll stop now, but I keep getting requests to, since I'm co-host, I guess, to admit people into the, I guess I can.
No, don't worry about that.
Okay.
We'll handle that.
Okay. All right, here is the first slide. Can you all see that slide?
Yeah.
Good. All right, it's the cover of the book. All right, Becoming Gaia. We can understand this phrase actually in from two directions. Obviously, we're talking about the human, primarily, the human species becoming Gaia. But we can also understand it as with Gaia being the subject, that Gaia herself, and I say herself, is becoming something other. So both the human and this living planet as a whole is in a process of becoming something other. This is the theme of the book. And this becoming can be described as an initiation. And like all initiations, which I'll expand upon momentarily, this initiation involves what can be described as a collective or planetary near-death experience. So I want to begin with this quotation from Carl Jung that really captures the deeper quality of our moment. I'll just read it to you for those of you who might not be able to see it clearly. A mood of universal destruction and renewal has set its mark upon our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment, for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. This peculiarity of our time, which is certainly not of our conscious choosing, is the expression of the unconscious human within us who is changing. Coming generations will have to take account of this momentous transformation if humanity is not to destroy itself through the might of its own technology and science. So much is at stake, and so much depends on the psychological constitution of the modern human. So that's from, I think it's from 1957, the year of my birth, as it turns out, from the little book, The Undiscovered Self. Okay, so forgive that little beep. It's an artifact of this application here. This is a the headline from a quite brilliant piece that appeared in the New York Times the day before yesterday. So if you can look that up, we are the 5th. So I think this February 3rd, New York Times. Amanda Hess. Apocalypse when? Global warming's endless scroll. From Don't Look Up to Greta Thunberg's videos to doomsday memes, we are awash in warnings that we are almost out of time. But the climate crisis is outpacing our emotional capacity to describe it. Okay. And it's so true. I mean, from movies, headlines, blog posts, video presentations, we hear the word apocalypse, we hear doom, doomers, doomsday, all kinds of ends. And I want to share with you now some other headlines, actually, that I've been collecting. I've sort of stopped collecting them the way I was because there's just too many, but I still do occasionally collect them, as I did this one the day before yesterday. But some headlines from the past 2 or so years, which capture what this, what Amanda is talking about here. And I would say that, you know, many of us either do not have or are losing the emotional capacity to take these headlines in and what the headlines are pointing to, and also the cognitive, intellectual capacity, for the simple reason that the human being is still evolving the organs of perception. You could say the planet herself, Gaia herself, is in the process of evolving a new organ of perception that will allow herself and the human, or maybe allow herself through the human, to take in, to perceive, to grasp, to hold in mind and heart the reality of what is going on. So I think we need to be gentle with ourselves if we can't quite get it. And certainly I want to encourage you for the next 10 slides or so to remember to breathe, and to not, to not be too hard on yourself if you find yourself either dissociating or feeling a little sad or angry. All right. So this is from a little over 2 years ago. When is it now? Actually, it's 4 years ago now. I can't believe it. Time flies. Only 12 years left to mitigate climate catastrophe. Perhaps you realize, you remember this headline. It was coming before the release of the IPCC report of the time. Right, 12 years left. The world's oceans and all marine life are on the brink of total collapse. Not clear how many people are aware of this, but it's true. And it's very, very hard to take in. Well, what would that mean if all marine life collapsed? And if it's on the brink, when? Global warming will happen faster than we think. Okay, so this is also 4 years ago. And indeed, that's what we've seen. The data have been outstripping even the most pessimistic projections from the previous 2 IPCC reports. This one is from 2019, March. Okay, so right at the beginning of the pandemic, right? We are in deep trouble. Carbon emissions break record in devastating global setback. Now, people thought that many people were saying after a year of the pandemic, during the so-called great pause, that, the planet might recover, carbon levels are dropping, but in fact, the carbon levels weren't dropping. Only the rate at which we were pumping carbon into the atmosphere dropped for a little while, but the total amount of carbon continued to rise, unfortunately. There goes that little beep. Okay. I'm sure you're all aware of the overheating of the Arctic, heat waves in Siberia, which is unheard of. I'm not going to dwell too long on here because I'm sure you're aware of them. Planet entering a new climate regime, extraordinary heat waves. So we went from the oceans, wildlife collapse from climate change is predicted to hit suddenly and sooner. Okay? So not a gradual descent, not a gradual gently going into that bad night, but a cliff edge over which life itself, complex life, is poised to plunge. So here we are now in 2020, I believe it is. One last chance, Time magazine, the defining year for the planet. Well, if that was the defining year, what was the decision? One wonders, 2 years ago. Okay, unfortunately, not much has changed for the better. Worried about Earth's future? Well, the outlook is worse than even scientists can grasp. So just take a moment to breathe now. I would invite you to do so. I will do so too. European floods are latest sign of a global warming crisis. Now, many of you are in Europe. You will remember the catastrophic floods in Germany and England in particular, elsewhere I'm sure, but those are the places that I remember seeing from Berkeley. No one is safe. Extreme weather batters the wealthy world, which of course we've been seeing here on the west coast of the North American continent, all the way from British Columbia in Canada, all the way down south to Los Angeles. Fires raging, wildfires raging. We're hurtling toward global suicide. This is from just a little over a year ago. Why we must do everything differently to ensure the planet's survival. Civilization ending climate change is knocking on the door unless we act now. This is almost a year ago. Okay. All right, so I mean, how can we possibly take this in? One wonders. If we take these headlines, just they're accelerating, and they're all saying the same thing. Time not only is running out, but in a sense has already run out. Okay. I don't know if you've seen this before. It's a representation of heat anomalies. It only goes up to 2017, so you have to imagine it getting even worse at the end. But you'll see here, you'll see the date. Move this from 1880, starts at 1880. Okay, red represents higher than expected average. Here we are coming up, First World War, not much is happening. Between the two world wars, beginning of the Second World War, now we're at the start of the so-called Great Acceleration, massive increase in population, burning of fossil fuels. Okay, coming up to the fall of the Berlin Wall, end of the Soviet Union, the new millennium. And here we are. Okay. All right. Oops. Okay. That. This is just one graph, data point focusing on CO2 emissions. Perhaps you've seen it before. It stretches over 800,000 years, which, our own species, Homo sapiens sapiens, emerged somewhere around here 300,000 years ago. Our hominin ancestors were around at the beginning of this graph, but our species is only popping up around here. And what we see over these 800,000 years is a naturally occurring oscillation, much like the beating of a heart or the in and out breath of the planet as a whole. in and out, in and out, of rising and falling CO2 levels, and with them corresponding variations in temperature, until we get to the Holocene, after the last ice age, and then into the latter part of the 20th century, where this goes vertical. Okay, so this wall here is like the cliff edge that we encountered in the headlines about the possibility of the end of complex life on the planet and climate catastrophe and so on. This is a similar graph, but it's not absolute CO2 levels, but rather it is the rate of change in levels of CO2 level. And it's a recent graph, the so-called skyscraper graph, but it's also over the last 800,000 years. And you see that during this period, things did change quite suddenly. But this is where we are now. This is the rate of change, the difference in the rate of change in our own time, which points to the acceleration of all of the processes involved. This is a collection of various graphs from the Great Transition Institute that on the right here represent physical Earth system changes, and on the left, human social economic trends. So on the Earth system ones, of course, you can see CO2 levels here, nitrous oxide and methane, the three most important greenhouse gases, but other indicators too, like ocean acidification and so on. And here you see such things as population, real GDP, energy use, and so on, numbers of emails received every day. No, that's not in there, but I couldn't resist throwing it in. What you'll notice is that all of these graphs, first of all, they're correlated. The human and the Earth system graphs are all correlated, and they're all showing a more or less exponential acceleration at about the same time, which is centered here around 1945, 1950, the beginning of the nuclear age, which is the starting point for what many people are now calling the Great Acceleration. It's also a preferred point for many people to signal the beginning of the so-called Anthropocene, the new geological age, which we are not only witnessing, but which we have initiated in our own time. Okay. So all of these graphs, with the exponential curve going up, that remember we call this sort of cliff edge, are associated with not only the possibility, but the seeming inevitability of some kind of death, of collapse and death, which is why I say that the whole Earth community, certainly the human community, but the other than human community as well, is being drawn willy-nilly into a collective or planetary near-death experience. So this is showing that similar oscillation of life, the heartbeat, respiration, and so on, flatlining, going towards this point. Oh, forgive me for that little beep. Now, those who have studied near-death experiences have noted that in many cases, certainly not in all, but in many cases, those who come back from a near-death experience tend to manifest a radical change in fundamental values, in sense of self, of identity, one which moves in the direction of a much wider and deeper sense of self, in continuity with the world as a whole, sometimes the cosmos as a whole, sometimes other dimensions, but a radical openness to what might be described as our interbeing, to use the term of the dearly recently departed Thich Nhat Hanh. So a shift in identity from a sense of a vulnerable, separate self to one that is defined through its interbeing with the wider Earth community and with the spiritual realm. Okay. This is a possibility in near-death experience. It's not guaranteed, but it seems to be what many people report as a potential result of experiencing, of undergoing this kind of experience. Now, in approaching the complexity and emotional intensity and depth of our planetary moment, I believe it's essential to bring what could be described as an integral perspective, say holistic, but I use the word integral. You could also say complex or comprehensive. This is a graph from Duane Elgin's recent book called Choosing Earth, which I highly recommend. That gives a sense of his integral approach to our planetary moment. I think it's useful to consider for a moment. So to be integral, I don't think I can move this, can I? Oh, I can, good. To be truly integral or comprehensive, one would need both a sufficiently wide perspective and a long one and a deep one. So obviously long runs counter to the dominant tendency in business as usual, which is really only interested in the next quarter, the next hour. But we need to be thinking in terms of centuries and millennia, since the actions that we are doing now are in fact determining the fate of the rest of the Earth community for millennia to come. The wide perspective means considering not only the human predicament, certainly not only our personal predicament, but a wider social one, and extending beyond the human to the other than human, to the web of life in which we're embedded. And here to consider not only by wide, they're saying, considering not only social, economic questions, but ethical questions, which brings us to the depth dimension. We need consciously to inquire into fundamental guiding values, into the interior psychological dimension, cultural dimension of worldviews, to the level of the paradigm, the fundamental assumptions and root metaphors that structure our experience and understanding of ourselves and of the cosmos. For the rest of our time today, I'm going to be focusing mostly on this psychological dimension, and particularly the dimension of Jungian and transpersonal psychology. Okay. Now, from a Jungian perspective, as you could see from the opening quotation, we could say that the most telling characterization of our collective moment, of our planetary moment now, from a depth psychological or transpersonal perspective, is that we are engaged, we are engaging with and being gripped by the archetype of death rebirth. Okay, the death rebirth archetype, which from the Jungian perspective is arguably the central archetype of the psyche. He also calls it the self, but when we look into the nature of the self, we see that it can be characterized in terms of this mystery, ongoing mystery of the life cycle, or the death rebirth cycle. And that's what I want to focus on here. We could also describe it in terms of metamorphosis or transformation. The deep nature of the self, of the cosmos even, is one of ongoing metamorphosis or transformation from one sense of self to another, presumably this other being one that is more transparent to the deeper nature of the real, of the mystery. So the transformation is not just a random change, it's transformation in the direction of deepening into the mystery, deepening into the nature of the real, however you want to describe that. And that will differ depending upon your tradition and experience and so on. for Jung, who talked about this process in terms of what he called individuation, or the actualization of the true self, he noted again and again that the process is not linear. We intuit the goal, which is represented by the center of the mandala. In this case, it's the lovely labyrinth pattern from Chartres Cathedral. We intuit the center, which is the goal, our true self, the true nature of what we always already are, but nevertheless must strive fully to actualize. We intuit and we approach it in that intuition, but what happens often is that no sooner do we intuit it than we turn away or we're led astray, and we circle around it until we can approach it again in a circuitous manner, a circuitous spiraling manner. It's not linear. Okay, so this is Jung on the nature of the self and this process of ongoing transformation. Another way to describe the process is in terms of the deep structure of rites of passage. And this is another way of saying initiation, a ritual of initiation or a rite of passage, more or less the same thing. And anthropologists have known for quite some time, starting with Arnold van Gennep's work on rites of passage, that these kinds of rituals have share a same deep structure, a kind of a three-phase deep structure, leading from the old self, separation from the old self, to the new self, passing through a liminal phase. Liminal is from the Greek word limen, which means threshold. So a movement across a threshold from old self to the new self. Those of you who are familiar with Joseph Campbell will recognize this as the pattern of the hero's journey, the so-called monomyth. It's arguably the most universally distributed archetypal structure that describes the fundamental nature of process or development, which we see even in stories, all kinds of narratives, and so on. So the rite of passage, though, engages this deep structure in the interest of catalyzing a shift in identity. Usually, typically, for instance, in young men passing from puberty to manhood, and but there are many other kinds of rites of passage in traditional societies. All societies, human societies, had these rites until relatively recently in terms of human evolution, and many indigenous cultures continue to have them. It's really only the modern civilizations that have lost their relationship to these rites of passage. All of these rites, however, reason I'm bringing them up is in the passage through the liminal phase, what characterizes the liminal phase is an encounter with death. Often a literal encounter with a situation that threatens literal death, or at least involves intense suffering and pain. But if not the risk of literal death, then at least a symbolic death. And it seems that that encounter is necessary in order to destructure the old self and make room for the new self. This is an image that you can actually find in Joseph Campbell's World Atlas of Mythology. It depicts the male initiation rite of the Mandan Indians of the Mississippi Valley. Very intense. You can see they would hook themselves, suspend themselves from hooks around this central pole, and they would, need to demonstrate that they could withstand this pain and suffering until the weight of their own bodies released them from the hooks. After which they would compete running from that spot to the river. And, at one point asked why they do this, one of the elders said, well, our women suffer bringing us into this world, and this is the way we need to do it to become men. All right. So here we pass from Jung to Stanislav Grof, who just turned 90 this year. What to say about Stan? I mean, he, I think after Jung, he is probably the greatest living psychologist in that tradition. Like, it passes from Freud to Jung to Grof, in my estimation, other people's estimation. He was trained in Prague as a medical doctor, and then a psychiatrist, and then as a Freudian psychoanalyst, and was operating out of that Freudian materialistic worldview at the beginning of his career in communist Czechoslovakia, until one day he and his colleagues received some ampules from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland that contained LSD 25, and it was recommended that they might experiment with this new chemical, since it seemed to induce a temporary psychosis, is how it was initially described. And it was thought that therapists might benefit from experiencing firsthand what it was like to be insane. So Stan and his colleagues also wondered whether it might be useful to treat patients, and indeed they found that it was very, very useful. The traditional Freudian approach, Stan and his colleagues had realized, it was not very effective for the people that they were treating who were suffering from very debilitating neuroses and sometimes psychoses. The simple talk therapy just did not go deep enough to make any difference, even though they, Stan thought that the model was good enough as far as it went. When they started using LSD in controlled, supervised sessions with their clients, they found that the material that was being surfaced in these sessions did confirm the Freudian view of the unconscious. The patients could experience firsthand, as though were happening in the present, all of the layers of their own past, going back through the early childhood trauma and so on. But it quickly, what happened in these sessions was that the material that was being revealed very quickly outstripped the Freudian unconscious, since, to begin with, it seemed that inevitably, when the patients were encouraged to track the intensity of their experiences, the traumatic episodes would inevitably lead them back to the birth experience, to the trauma of birth, and not only to birth, but to the whole situation surrounding birth, the so-called perinatal realm. And while this was happening, typically, these seeming reliving of the birth experiences were accompanied by or oscillated with all kinds of other experiences of a more transpersonal nature, of a more Jungian nature, that involved archetypal sequences and identifications or visions, identifications with or visions of deities and so on. Now, Stan also experimented in a controlled situation with the LSD himself, and had the direct experience of a radical expansion of awareness of his sense of self, which completely shattered his previous Freudian materialistic, reductionistic view of the psyche, and made him much more open to Jung, and much more sensitive to the world's spiritual religious traditions and so on. And he went on to, through thousands of sessions with patients in Czechoslovakia, then Johns Hopkins University and the Maryland Psychiatric Institute here. And then after using non-drug techniques of holotropic breathwork, confirming his research, he went on to propose the most comprehensive map or cartography of the psyche that anyone has proposed since then. All right, so this is Stan Grof, but I want to focus on particularly on the region of the psyche that he described as the perinatal dimension. And the perinatal dimension is important because it's a kind of bridge between the personal and the transpersonal. And it's that bridge because birth is the occasion where we all experience this deep structure of initiation. Simply by virtue of having been born, we have gone through this archetypal process of death and rebirth. We know what it's like to die to the old self that was initially identified with, fused with, continuous with the self of the mother. We know what it's like to die to that self and to be reborn, which we call birth, reborn as a relatively autonomous organism. Okay? And because the process of birth itself participates in that deep structure of death rebirth, or you could say the archetype of life itself, Stan found that the patterns that describe the perinatal process can be taken as snapshots of the deep structure of the archetype of death rebirth and can be applied across many different domains. And that's what I'm doing here in showing how Stan's insights into the perinatal process can help us grasp the deeper archetypal character of our current moment, which is one of a planetary initiation, near-death experience, involving the activation of the death rebirth archetype. So I hope that's making sense. Okay. These are the 4 phases of the perinatal process, and they incorporate the 3 stages of clinical birth. So the basic perinatal matrix, if you take the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th basic perinatal matrix, they correspond to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd stages of clinical birth. Stan has added this 1st phase here, the 1st perinatal matrix, which goes from conception to the onset of labor. Okay, so which gives us 4 basic perinatal matrices. The 1st perinatal matrix. So during this phase, if we're talking about the organism, not as an experiential as well, but yeah, during this phase, the fetus has all of its needs immediately met. Well, we're talking about a good womb here, right? If they're not significant issues with the process, all of its biological needs are being met. No need to breathe, eat, just in a state of dreaming innocence, we might say. This is the 1st phase. Right. Okay. Now, experientially, when individuals contact this matrix, whether it involves apparent actual reliving of the time in the mother's womb, or whether or not that somatic memory is merely the conduit for other kinds of experiences that resonate with it, what people tend to experience, how they tend to experience this matrix, is in terms of a kind of what Stan describes as an oceanic oneness, as a sense of being contained in a cosmic amniotic fluid, with weightless, with no boundary, no distinct boundary between one's sense of self and not self. Okay? This is typical of the good womb experience of the first perinatal matrix. You could call it the oceanic, undisturbed intrauterine state. Now we can see, however, many manifestations of this good womb oceanic fusion state around us. Hopefully you all have experiences in your own life, what this might feel like. And okay, I'm just going to make sure that nobody's trying to get a hold of me through the chat here. I'm going to assume that's all right, and that if anybody needs me really badly, you'll just speak up. So here we have the practice of Shinrin Yoku, or forest bathing, which is very popular in Japan, but is elsewhere as well, where people intentionally go into the woods, into the forest, and the image of bathing, which is reminiscent of being suspended in the amniotic fluid of the all-nourishing mother, that people not only can feel relaxed, but regenerated, fed at a very deep level by doing this. So any kind of experience where you can relax your sense of the separate self sense and feel yourself contained within and nourished by an all-surrounding womb-like environment is related to the gestalt of this first basic perinatal matrix. Okay. We also can contact it whenever we feel certain emotions of kindness or abundance, love, obviously, particularly in the kind of love where one feels continuous with the other, and where the heart is completely uncontracted. Gratitude, right? These kinds of feelings all suggest the deep sense of the archetypal character of the first perinatal matrix. This is the positive sense. Also with, this is a new book by, what's his name now? Transition Town. Oh, I can't remember his name now. I know you know who I'm talking about. It's a liability of reaching a certain age. Names sometimes take a while to arrive. So the sense of possibility that we can imagine, yes, that we can feel into, intuit, and imagine the possible, particularly a possible that gives a sense of positive containment, right? This is all related to the first perinatal matrix. Now, this is also a manifestation of the activation of the first perinatal matrix, which many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. Some people call it the law of attraction or positive thinking. And there's a deep, cultural roots, particularly in this country, the idea of positive thinking going back to the 19th century with the New Thought movement, which was a precursor of what came to be called the New Age movement. But we see it in all kinds of traditions, philosophically, and in radical forms of idealism, in certain forms of meditation practice, and so on. The idea that, as many people say, that we create our own reality. Okay. So this again suggests that there's no boundary between thinking and reality, no boundary between the image of something and the reality of something. This is typical of this first perinatal matrix experience. I found this online. You can look this person up if you want. I have great respect for the truth of this insight, particularly around, let's say, the potential for mind-body healing. I've seen many people's lives be improved by positive thinking. At the same time, I can't help but feel that I've seen people in my community gravitating toward the doctrine, the teaching of positive thinking and the belief that we create our own reality as a kind of escape from reality. A friend sent a cartoon this morning. I didn't have time to upload it, but if you can picture it, there's a big dinosaur talking to another dinosaur, and in the background, you can see the asteroid entering the atmosphere that's just about to wipe them out. It was the last mass extinction 66 million years ago. And one of the dinosaurs is saying, hey, have we tried positive thinking? So, all right. So my point is that each of these matrices, each of these dimensions of the death rebirth archetype have positive and negative valencies. They have great potential, and they have also certain risks and dangers that we need to be alert to. Just pointing that out with positive thinking here. Another negative manifestation of the first perinatal, the archetypal dimension of the first perinatal matrix, is escape through literal overdose, through drugs. One can imagine escaping through the fantasy of the omnipotence of thought, that we can just think our way or imagine our way out of this situation. But people also seek escape through opioids and other drugs. And of course, we've seen in our own time a radical increase in opioid addiction and deaths, particularly from synthetic opioids that I'm sure you're all aware of. All right, so this tendency to want to escape, it's understandable. You know, a certain amount of escape is not only inevitable, I think it's actually healthy. I'm not just rationalizing my own tendencies to escape, but you know, we need moments of escape, whether it's through drama, just through fantasy, even a glass of wine, who knows? We all need it to a certain extent. But if it goes into addiction, if it goes into overdose, into non-productive or actually self or other destructive behavior, then we can suspect that there is a clinging to that phase of the transformation process as a form of resistance to going into the next phase. And the next phase is captured here in this image, the second basic perinatal matrix, which is when labor has begun, but the cervix is still closed. Okay. So the fetus is still in the womb, but is now experiencing these rhythmic pulses of pressure with no exit, with nowhere to go. And this is what characterizes the archetypal gestalt of the second perinatal matrix. We could think the term that Stan uses is no exit. He also talks about cosmic engulfment, but no exit. Okay. This is an image from a holotropic breathwork session that is very typical of the second perinatal matrix, where in this case, an octopus figure, which we know from psychoanalytic literature is a typical symbolic expression of the mother, and particularly the way the maternal organism can be experienced to the fetus during the onset and throughout the actual process of labor. So cosmic engulfment right here. No exit. Okay, so clinically, this matrix is correlated, Stan has found, with inhibited depression, so deep, chronic, debilitating depression, where there's the sense of meaninglessness, emptiness, and that there's just no way out. Okay, so one can see how, with all of the headlines we saw at the beginning, that more and more people are starting to feel this sort of situation. There's just no exit, no way out. So the second matrix is being severely activated in this case, and an understandable reaction would be to retreat to the first matrix through various forms of addiction. Okay. Or simply, there's suicide as well. Depression, suicide, climate anxiety, climate grief. But there's a positive expression of the second matrix as well. And that has to do with the bringing to awareness of the not only the importance, but the necessity, and one could even say the deep spiritual character of boundaries, of limits. And you could think of it in this way, that if there was no limit, if there was no boundary, there would in fact be no cosmos. If everything was simply and purely infinite, there would be nothing finite. But if there would be nothing finite, nothing would exist, right? So for there to be something rather than nothing, for there to be any manifestation or cosmos at all, there needs to be limit or boundary. This is it's a deep metaphysical truth and mystery, in fact, the relationship between the infinite and the finite, between the boundless and the bounded. And to get to the bounded, which is to get to something rather than nothing, we need limits. So one of the things that we're experiencing now that is a focal point of planetary awareness for those who have the the luxury and privilege to do this kind of contemplation, is that we realize now that there are limits, there are planetary boundaries that we need to stay within if life is to continue and to flourish. And indeed that we have surpassed many of these boundaries. Biospheric integrity, we're already in the red in terms of the web of life. Biogeochemical flows, particularly carbon, nitrogen, methane here. But these other ones, I mean, atmospheric, aerosol loading, they don't climate change. I'm surprised that this is not way over into the red. I think it should be. So we can take this image as an indicator of our crisis, but we can also take it as a positive manifestation of the rising into our awareness of the need to honor boundaries and limits. And this is, I would suggest, a positive manifestation of the deep archetypal character of the second perinatal matrix. We also see it in, these creative responses to our planetary situation with proposals. Again, this one from an older book of Dwayne Elgin, for voluntary simplicity, or in the, which is the idea of living more with less. So you can see this linking, essential linking of life and of sustainability of the life process, and the quality of life, with a positive relationship to boundaries. In this case, less stuff. Oops. We see it again, finally, with the degrowth movement. The only sustainable growth is degrowth. So these are all positive, I would say, manifestations of a positive relationship to the archetypal character of the second perinatal matrix. Now, in the birth process, of course, if all goes well, the cervix begins to open, labor, the contractions continue, and now that the cervix is open, the fetus can begin to participate in the process, in the birth process, and not be simply a kind of passive victim to these increasing pressures that are coming from somewhere, but with no sense of how one might actively participate in it. And this is the signals the onset of the second stage of biological birth, but which in Stan Grof's model is the third basic perinatal matrix. Now, the key phrase for the third perinatal matrix, remember the first one you could say is oceanic fusion. The second matrix you could describe as no exit. The third matrix can be described in terms of the life and death struggle. Okay? And for many of us, it really was a life and death struggle with the very real possibility of death, not only for the infant, but for the mother as well, since they are really more or less a single organism functionally until the cutting of the umbilical cord. So during this phase of birth, the infant's body can experience literally crushing, suffocating pressures on the skull, on the esophagus, but also since the infant is still getting its oxygen through the umbilical cord and the placenta, this can be, the cord can be wrapped around the neck, or it can be otherwise compromised, and the infant can experience asphyxiation as well as strangulation and so on. Now, for those people who have contacted this phase of the birth process through deep experiential work, what they report is that not only these kinds of crushing pressures and a sense of struggling for life itself and a confrontation with death, but states of extreme psycho-emotional and spiritual arousal on the one hand. So the biological energies of the body, of sexuality, of eroticism, of just raw sensation, are activated to the utmost, while at the same time there is a confrontation with and a struggle against death, with the possibility of death. So here we come to the crux, actually, of the near-death encounter of the deep structure of the rite of passage. Okay. This is an image which characterizes the archetypal qualities of the third perinatal matrix. I imagine most of you recognize it. It's the right panel of Hieronymus Bosch's triptych from the Garden of Earthly Delights, early 16th century, utterly surreal, remarkable painting that one could contemplate endlessly. This scene here, it really looks like something from the 20th century world wars. But all of these other images of body parts that are hyperstimulated. You can see the sound is hyperstimulated, being cut through by a knife. Strange organic forms which are morphing into other forms. Images of people suffering enormous sort of tortures, and yet also strangely, presumably, some of them enjoying what they're experiencing. Like a paradoxical mixture of sensual delight and agony. This is typical of the third perinatal matrix. In terms of our collective moment, well, let me say this. In terms of clinical psychopathology, the third perinatal matrix is typically associated with all kinds of disorders and symptoms involving disorders of sexuality and aggression. So we could think of the two sort of Freudian primal instincts of sex and death, or sex and aggression. Situations involving malignant aggression and violence are typically correlated to some kind of fixation or disturbance associated with the third perinatal matrix. This will often mean that there was something that happened at that phase of birth, but it can't be reduced to the actual birth experience. It's simply that deep structure of this phase of the birth experience serves as an organizing pivot for all kinds of images and emotions that can manifest in various ways. In this case, if we think of our collective moment as one of a planetary birth experience where a new identity is struggling to emerge, we can expect all moments of the perinatal process to be manifesting in a sense simultaneously. As we've seen, we see people trapped in a sense of no exit. We see people retreating to a kind of regression to the first matrix. We also see people acting out the intense violence that is typical of the experience of the third perinatal matrix. Now, we saw it in this country, the United States, a little over a year ago, of course, in an unprecedented manner, where the state capitol was overrun by mobs, and several people were killed and many, many more injured. And the very structure, the very heart of American democracy was threatened, and still is, by people who are raging against the reality of our moment and proposing that the only solution is violence. Okay, so this, I would suggest, is a typical manifestation of a rather unintegrated relationship to the archetypal energies of the third perinatal matrix. But there are more integrated, integral ways of relating to these energies, as we see with Greta Thunberg. I don't want your hope. I don't want you to be hopeful, she said. I want you to panic, and this panic is typical of the third perinatal matrix, and act as if the house was on fire. So these two images, the house, which is our oikos, our ecology, which is the old Greek word for household, which is also the same root for economy. So economy, ecology, oikos, house. Our house is on fire, as it is literally. It's burning up. And Greta, God bless her, is able to articulate this so clearly, but in a way that is not advocating violent destruction, but creative, principled confrontation with the extremity of our situation, right? We also see it in the youth climate movement, Fridays for the Future, action, right? Action on behalf of life. We see it marvelously in the Extinction Rebellion movement, marvelously because the very name, Extinction Rebellion. So extinction captures this threat to life itself on a planetary scale, planetary near-death experience. We're facing extinction, but there's a rebellion against it. In other words, this is the life-death struggle, a struggling against death on behalf of life. This is the other motto of Extinction Rebellion, is rebel for life. So we have both elements of the life-death struggle here, with extinction and life, and rebelling against it. This is a famous die-in, early die-in from Extinction Rebellion, where people are, enacting what is actually happening and what is wanting to happen, namely a conscious, mindful, heartful confrontation with opening up to the mystery of death and rebirth, and what is happening to the whole Earth community. Okay. Now, to the extent that we can do this consciously, we can also, anticipate experiences of the fourth and final perinatal matrix, right, where the baby has been born. Here, the placenta is still attached, but it will be cut, and in an ideal situation, the infant survives, is healthy, is relatively autonomous, but of course still depends radically upon whoever the primary caregiver is. Traditionally, that's the mother, but it need not be the mother. But the experience of this fourth matrix, and this is one of the great paradoxes, this is the central paradox, really, of planetary initiation of the perinatal process, and that is to be born. Fully to be born means to experience death, that one cannot be born without simultaneously, in a sense, dying. And people who do contact and fully live the fourth perinatal matrix will experience a total ego death, a total disappearance of every reference point and structure that had previously defined who they thought they were. And it's somewhat like hurtling past the event horizon of a black hole. This is an artist's representation of a black hole here, where, as far as we know, of course we don't know because nobody has come back from that particular journey, but as far as we know, nothing escapes this event horizon. No matter, no energy, space and time itself fold into the mystery of the cosmological singularity, so-called, that is what a black hole is. So this is a culmination of the perinatal process at the heart of the fourth perinatal matrix, which Stan describes as the death rebirth experience. So we go from the death rebirth struggle to the death rebirth experience. So, you know, one can understand the resistance one might have to this transition, because you really need to be able to let go of everything that you have known, everything that has grounded you, and trust that there is something else on the other side. If one is not able to let go, one can imagine all kinds of fantasies of escape, whether, you know, kind of regression to the first matrix again, or to a premature imagining of the kind of liberation that awaits us on the other side of the death rebirth experience. And one of these fantasies of liberation, I think, is the idea of escaping to another planet, and let's say terraforming Mars, which is, we know, is a big dream of Elon Musk and Bezos and others. And you know, I admit it was and still is a fascination for me in terms of some of the literature I read and so on. But I must confess that I think it's a distraction from, or can be and often is a distraction from, what needs to be faced if we are to make the best of the situation that we're in. Right. So again, the key element here that I want to point to is the fantasy of liberation. In this case, liberation through technology. So the fourth matrix is about liberation. If the total ego death is successfully negotiated, there is a liberation. There's a liberation from that death rebirth struggle and a rebirth into a new identity. But the trajectory that our hypermodern, you know, late capitalist culture is on is the fantasy of liberation through technology and the recreation of an artificial womb through that technology. And this is the fantasy of the transhumanists who point to their own notion of a liberating so-called singularity, where, you know, the convergence of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and renewable energy, and so on, will not only save us from catastrophe, but transition us into a new ideal world. Okay. We're almost over, just a few slides here. Ideally, of course, if we're talking about biological birth, when the baby is born, what will then happen is that there is a healthy relationship between whoever the mother is. Need not be the biological mother, need not be a woman, but, you know, of course, in evolutionary terms, that's what it was. So I'll say mother in quotation marks, a healthy relationship between the mother and the child. And by healthy, you know, what I mean, we know from developmental psychology that what's essential for the healthy development of the child is that the mother relate to the child in a way that is mindful of the child's own needs, and not in a way that uses the child to satisfy one's own needs. If we do the latter, we're actually relating to the child as an object rather than a subject, as an it rather than a thou, to use Martin Buber's terms. And we know that when that happens, we are setting the child up for things like narcissistic personality disorder, various forms of sociopathology, or even predisposing them to schizophrenia. So what we need then for a healthy relationship to this new identity, and which gives us a clue to the nature of this new identity, is a relationship, a style, a mode of relationship based on I, thou, rather than I, it, on mutuality, on interbeing. Now, in this case, we're not talking about the relationship between an individual mother and a baby, but between the mother of us all, Gaia, and humanity, which is the child of Gaia, undergoing its own death, rebirth experience. So it's a little more complicated. And it's complicated because in our case, the child that is being born, the human, is responsible for what's happening to the biosphere, is responsible for bringing the Earth community towards this collective near-death experience with mass extinction and climate chaos and so on, which is challenging the human to assume a responsibility, a new kind of responsibility of reciprocity toward Gaia, which is something that clearly an infant can't do toward the mother. So it's a different situation in that sense. In fact, we could say that the human is being called in a way now to assume the role of parent to Gaia as child, while simultaneously recognizing that we remain a child of Gaia. Right? So and we see this dual reciprocal relationship between the human and Gaia beautifully expressed here with the Pachamama ritual, or earth feeding ritual of these indigenous people. I believe it's in Peru, where in fully recognizing that they are children of Pachamama, of the Mother Earth, they honor that relationship by regularly and ritually offering precious foods and herbs and so on to Earth to feed Mother Earth so that we will continue to be fed. Oh, I have a few more slides here. Now, we can see what's wanting to happen here. There are many manifestations of it. This is the basic structure of the Earth Charter that I won't dwell on here, but I encourage you to look up the Earth Charter, which is an expression of the new identity, the new worldview that is struggling to emerge, which would be consistent with the values of reciprocity, of interbeing, of the new relationship between the human and the Earth community that is required of us at this time. We see it in the movement of integral ecology. This is from Pope Francis's version of integral ecology, expressed in his encyclical Laudato Si, showing the overlap and interdependence between these three fundamental dimensions, you could say, of the environmental, the social, and the spiritual. There are many varieties of integral ecologies. If you're interested, you might want to look at a book that I co-edited a few years ago that outlines major movements in this field. We see it in the movement of not only interreligious dialogue, but the movement of religion, the field of religion and ecology, where religions, the world's religions and spiritual traditions are encountering one another across and in relationship to a common shared value, which is the value of our shared home and community. Now, I explored this a little bit, the idea of a second axial age in the first chapter of the book. All right, 2 more slides and we're done. To conclude, we're witnessing, again, a paradoxical double birth here. A new human is struggling to emerge out of the Gaian womb, a new human that is aware of itself as a child of Gaia in the way that, of course, indigenous communities have been aware for millennia, but in a new way, since there's a whole new understanding of Gaia, of its evolutionary history, and so on. A new human is struggling to emerge, while at the same time, a new Earth is emerging out of the human. So there's a simultaneous double birth happening now. A new human out of Gaia and a new sense of Gaia out of the human. And this is what I try to capture with the idea of the Gaia Anthropocene. No guarantee of a successful birth, of course, but this is where we are. And I think I will leave it at that. I went over.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Sean.
You're welcome.
Very, very rich presentation.
Thank you.
And I've got a much better understanding now. Yeah, sorry, you disappeared for a moment. I've got a much better understanding of the perinatal matrices and how they relate to what you've been saying. And I think a lot of what you've said, I mean, I think the Undiscovered Self is the most extraordinary book. And I've read it more than once and underlined large sections of it. And what Jung was talking about there was really the quality of the individual. And so if the individual is subsumed completely in the collective, there's no hope. And he said that the collective, you know, if you look, the more people there are at a dinner party, the cruder the conversation. If it's as he gives an example of that from his correspondence, and they said the collective intelligence is that of an alligator. That's his phrase from one of his letters. And so what you've been talking about is both obviously individual and collective, in that we have an individual aspect to us, but we're also part of the collective. And so anything that we do is an expression of the collective as well as being an expression of the individual. And Chris Beisch is very, very strong on this point. And so I suppose my question is a kind of constellating question, which is that we can all attend meetings like this and go through our own transformative process in the community and the network. We try to create a dialogue around all of this. But then how do you actually see this in terms of the collective? And you've mentioned some collective movements, Extinction Rebellion and so on, but it seems to me that if I just come back to Václav Havel and Arnold Toynbee, both of them said that without a worldwide spiritual revolution, you know, there isn't very much hope. And Toynbee is a very interesting case because he's an insider in the world system of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. He advocated a world state, get rid of all the nations. In other words, it's the kind of technocratic at one level. But I think that in the 1950s, he had some spiritual experiences which gave an extra depth. For those of you who don't know Arnold Toynbee, he wrote 12 volumes of the study of history, which explains the cyclical nature of every previous civilization, and why should we think that we are not part of a larger cycle. So those are just a few thoughts. Maybe you could just respond. Incidentally, we will go on until 1:15, because I'm sure there'll be other people wanting to ask questions. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, what's your initial response?
That's great, David. And I would love to say a few words about that. And what I'm also wondering, however, is may I take just 2 minutes while people are gathering their questions here. I really need to respect my embeddedness in natural processes for a second.
Okay, right. We'll have a 2-minute pause.
Just 2 minutes, and I'll be right back. And
okay, we'll wait. We'll be there. Right. You can see the many of us are sitting in book-lined rooms, and this is no exception in Sean's case. And we have a question from Suzanne Taylor in the chat, which I'll read out when Sean comes back. But let me just give Sean a chance to reflect on my remarks.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, Toynbee, I'm sure you know, David, his, I think his last book was called Mankind and Mother Earth, was it not?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I have that in my library in Scotland, but I must dig it out. And he also had incredible dialogue with Daisaku Ikeda, which is called Choose Life.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Choose Life. It's an amazing book, which I read in 1976 or something.
Wow.
And that really covers the totality of human affairs, both inner and outer. So
and of course,
well worth revisiting.
Yeah, I've got actually I found a secondhand copy of the abridged illustrated A Study of History, which is a beautiful book that he wrote, especially if those of you can't get the 12 volumes, there's a beautiful 1 volume. But yeah, so Toynbee, as you know, I mean, it's interesting that at the core of his perspective is really the same death rebirth archetype.
Very true.
It's the growth and death of civilizations, but he's, as you were saying, especially in later life, he's pointing in the direction of the emergence of something radically new on a planetary scale that would somehow be able to
underpinned by love.
Underpinned by love, yeah, you're right. So there's very deep parallels there with Toynbee, but complementary to Jung. So Jung did focus on and emphasize how it's the individual who's a carrier of consciousness, a transformation of consciousness. And he, as you say, he was quite allergic to mass-mindedness and sensitive to the dangers of collective psychosis and so on. And yet he was also so sensitive that we are participating in a transformation on a collective planetary scale. And that there is this paradoxical, complex relationship between the individual and the collective that we need to work out consciously. Jung was more introverted, perhaps, and focused on the individual. Toynbee, to use Jung's terms, was more extroverted and focused more on the collective.
Although he, in fact, because he became more spiritual, I think there's one interesting thing is unfortunately, after his death, his library was dispersed.
Oh.
So I was in Waterfield's secondhand bookshop in Oxford in the sort of late 1970s, and I bought a book on a small book by Théâtre de Chardin, which had Arnold Toynbee, and the other one that I could have bought, but I had it already, was Yogananda's autobiography.
Oh. Are either of them inspired?
I should have bought it anyway.
Oh, geez, that's neat.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see the kind of, and he was a Wickhamist. I used to teach at Winchester College, and he was a Wickhamist, and so I founded something called the Toynbee Society. Oh. And I think that Natalie and Claire are asking, we're talking about a study of history by Arnold Toynbee, but if you look him up, you'll see there are some shorter books. And also books of dialogues, and I wouldn't start with a study of history if I were you. 1,000 pages in the abridged edition, but it's one of the most important books of the 20th century. There's no doubt about that. Sheila, we'll come to you, and then I'm going to go to a very good question from Suzanne. Sheila.
Yes, thank you. Excellent, Sean. I've never heard anybody parallel so strongly the personal origin story with the new story, Thomas Berry's new story that wants to come. I would only like to tell people of the Prenatal and Perinatal Psychology Association, because their dictum is womb ecology is world ecology.
Perfect.
And I would also like to invite you to do what I'm doing with these patterns from the Chartres Cathedral.
Oh.
I've broken them up into embryonic developmental stages. And those stages have wayfinding behaviors. And I think if we ground the work into those indigenously, innately wise wayfinding behaviors that people can relate to because it's part of their own stories universally, we have a way forward.
Wow. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. I hope I can, I hope I can.
If you can connect me.
Could you maybe, I suggest that we bring your perspective into one of our Friday evening informal virtual bar sessions as something to explore in a bit more depth, because for those of you who aren't members of the network, we have a dialogue on a Monday, could come in there as well, and also a virtual bar on a Friday, where the people get the opportunity to interact a little more informally with each other, but based on experience. So I will send that. I'll send that suggestion. So very good question from Suzanne Taylor from not very far away from you, I don't think. She said, everyone, we keep hammering on what to do to fix things, but our greed-based worldview is what should get all our attention. If we cared about each other as much as we care about ourselves, we'd have the best chance to deal with the threats to us. How to encourage that? And what would you do if you ran the world? This is our key question. You maybe should go on to the podcast.
What would you do if you what, sorry?
If you ran the world.
Oh, if I ran the world. Oh.
Yeah, I don't think running the world is like, I don't personally agree with the model, but well, let's just talk about the greed-based worldview, because that is totally contrary to the indigenous view, as you know. And can I just point out, for those of you who are members, I reviewed Robin Wall Kimmerer's extraordinary book, Braiding Sweetgrass, in the current issue. And I urge you not only to read my review, but also to buy the book and absorb it. It's the most incredibly beautiful written book. And it has all your messages: reciprocity, honorable harvest, giving and receiving, giving first, you don't take first. So the greed-based worldview is a taking one. How would you address that?
Yeah, well, I'm getting an echo there. Okay, I don't know. What would I do? Well, I like the idea if I ran the world, because then I could round up all heads of CEOs, the heads of corporations, and the heads of board members, and most of the political leaders, most of whom are men, and invite them to a deep experiential retreat, perhaps assisted by sacred medicines or holotropic breath work, where they would have the opportunity to deepen into their own psyches. And, along with that, maybe have them witness actual childbirth. But only so much can be done for individuals who are fully formed.
So we lost you.
What we would need to do as well to start changing birth practices, start changing the way we support or don't support women giving birth and people who take care of children. Then we also have to start changing the way we grow our food, the relationship to the Pachamama. So until we address these foundational issues of women and women who are giving birth and how children are treated in these early years, I'm afraid that we'll keep producing more and more adults, particularly adult men, who are severely wounded in their attachments, and therefore are driven through compensation to lust for more, more things, more power.
Well, Donald Trump is a very good example of this.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Thanks, some fantastic ideas, and I think they're very fundamental ideas. And maybe we need to see if we can think of the 10 they're the 10 most important changes that, and they're all systemic, because as you probably know, Vanguard and BlackRock, the biggest of the investment trusts, they own the controlling shares in all the existing systems, from transport to media to pharmaceuticals to food. And so their model, if you like, is to keep the system in place, or else replace it with a technocratic Great Reset, which is what we're kind of up against at the moment. Let's go on to the next question, which comes from Darren Bender. Just unmute yourself.
Amazing. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, Darren. Yeah.
Amazing talk. Thank you so much. So much to think about. I'd love to hear your opinion on something that I've been developing and trying to sort of drum up some enthusiasm for, which is a concept I'm calling the Earth Year, which I've mentioned in forums before. Forgive me if it's a repetition to some, but William James in 1906 first mentioned the concept of national service, a government organized coming together of young people, normally men, but these days it would be everyone, to form an army for peace, as he described it, who would be as kind of rigorous and fit as any army for war. And I just think we need a modern version of that. Governments own huge amounts of land. In the US, federal land is 28%. In Britain, it's less, but there's still plenty of it. And I perceive it I see it as a kind of gap year, for kids coming out of school before they go to university and decide what they want to study for their careers. If they spent a year, maybe a couple of years in a deep ecology program, where they would all get the kind of scientific understanding, but also hands-on experiential understanding, a bit like the Schumacher College does with their courses, where they, if you go to the Schumacher College, which is a holistic science college in England, they give you an acre of land, and you spend a year in deep relationship with that acre of land.
That's great. Darren, that's fantastic. But did you have a question as well? Because
I'd just love to know what Sean thinks of a concept like that, because it's
now queuing up.
A generational change,
Yeah, no, it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea. I mean, imagine if we could have, instead of all this money being spent on weapons of destruction, mass destruction, and in the military as we normally conceive it, if we could think of channeling, again, mostly male energy, uninitiated male energy, into training in service to a wider identity of compassionate relationship with this living body of the living earth and the earth community. I'm totally with you. I think it's a brilliant idea. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Darren. Do bring that to one of our Mondays or Fridays as well, and we can have more of a chat about it. So get in touch with me or Paul Keenovitz or Paul Fillmore, and we'll take it forward.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great. And just to mention one other essay by William James that you may not be aware of, is The Moral Equivalent of War.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a very important. It tries to see how this male energy can be channeled into something more less destructive than war. Of course, competitive sport is one of the things he suggested. But it's about it's quite a late essay. But do have a look at this. I'm sure you can get it online. The moral equivalent of war.
Yeah, James is such he's one of my heroes.
Mine too.
By the way,
Andy and
yeah. So by the way, Richard Tarnas and I have just co-edited and released a new volume devoted to Stanislav Grof. It's called Psyche Unbound, Essays in Honor of Stanislav Grof. And my chapter in it is a chapter bringing together Stan and William James.
Well, I hope I'm on the review list.
Oh, good idea.
I know it's a big book because
we'll send you a copy. I'll send you a copy, David. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just saying, but my internet connection seems a little bit unstable. So if I suddenly drop out, Natalie, then you have to take over. Yes. I'm just going to, before I come to you, Carol, I'm going to go to Francesca, who says, what do you think is the most important aspect of the inner work we each need to do for our own initiation into being effective midwives of integral planetary transformation?
Oh, what a beautiful question. I mean, to me, the most important work is really to just keep trying to remember to keep getting up after we fall, in the direction of cultivating not a sense of fearlessness, but a willingness to be with the fear. So it's not a question of, I'm speaking of my own case where, you know, daily I'm aware of being buffeted by waves of anxiety around the sense of my own mortality, but my own mortality that is not other than what I'm sensing of the threat to the web of life and the people around me, the people I love and so on, the butterfly, everything. So there's these waves of fear that come in, and it's a question of getting rid of the idea that we need to not have that fear. It's rather simply being willing to not be afraid of the fear. Okay, so it's not to not have fear, but it's to work to not be afraid of the fear. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah.
To the extent that we can allow the fear in and breathe into it, and in so doing, remember and experience, however transiently, how our bodies, our awareness are constituted by our relationships, our unbroken relationships to everything and everyone that we love and that sustains us. You know, that's to me the most, and actually the only step we need to take. Yeah, I hope that helps. I mean, it's a long conversation.
Well, in your last chapter, you quoted climate activist Kate someone who says what we need is courage, not hope.
That's right. Marvel, Kate Marvel.
I thought that was yeah, and it's Kate someone. Carol, you're next. Where are you speaking from?
Hello.
You need to unmute.
I believe I've unmuted. Have I?
Yep.
Yeah.
Now you're muted, maybe, Carol. Can't hear you.
Now you've muted yourself again.
There. Are we there now? Yes.
Yeah.
Yay. Hi, everyone. I'm speaking from Hitchin, England. Thank you, Sean, for sharing your ideas. I feel as though there's kind of so many strands that we could kind of all pull together to make a whole, because there's so much about ideas of consciousness and differing perspectives that we're all kind of bringing a different viewpoint from to make a whole and contribute to our collective place. And I guess I'm curious about the dichotomy between the idea of we're in the end times and also this sense of repetition and rebirth, because there seems to be a polarity that maybe we, I guess, need to be, I wonder if we need to be cautious of. And I wonder if we should allow more space to be curious about what we don't know, because I suspect it's humanity's or a particular sector of society in humanity's perspective that we do know, and it's certainty that's caused us a lot of the problems that we have.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, well, to my mind, there is no certainty. Intellectually, I could say there's no certainty. But if I'm being true to myself, if I'm being honest with myself, in terms of what appears to be the case, which I tried to capture with the headlines at the beginning, and in terms of the consensus of experts who study these things, and with the idea that we have experienced the end of the Holocene, and we're experiencing the end of the Cenozoic, and so on. I feel ethically bound to acknowledge that we actually are at an end, and there's, maybe, I mean, I have some friends who believe that we are in ongoing contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, and that if we just get our act together soon enough, they will come and assist us. Maybe. There could be other higher beings who could miraculously, these are all possibilities, but I feel ethically bound not to count on them, and to act as if what seems increasingly likely, to prepare as though it were, in a sense, inevitable. That's what I feel ethically bound.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Carol. We need to move on. We've still got another couple of questions to get through. Sue.
Yes, hello. I'm just thinking, you were talking about the sort of pre-birth and the birth, and got to the birth bit, but I was reminded when you were talking about sort of men, the male energy that's not perhaps balanced, that Bill Plotkin, who was talking here, but also whose books I've read, he has a theory that actually we're kind of we haven't really got as humanity to the late adolescence yet. We're still kind of stuck. And I think, there's a sense in which some of those masculine energies, are unbalanced and destructive even. So I wondered, this is sort of looking at the developmental thing, taking it a bit further from the birth. But I think for me, at least, that's a helpful way to see, in a way, why it's difficult for us, although some of us obviously can better than others, but sort of collectively we seem to be stuck, in the consumer thinking, even though as you showed, all those headlines are telling us quite clearly, we still manage to sort of go on blindly towards the cliff edge somehow. And I just wanted to put in very briefly what I find useful because I think, connecting to Gaia is part of the answer. It has to be, and that's something we can all do in our own ways. And I like to follow the wheel of the year, to do the ceremonies for Imbolc that we've just had and so on, because that takes you into resonance with the seasons as they are actually happening. And there's also the death, rebirth of indeed the seasons of the year, which I think are very important to go through in a way with our psyche as well as the external. But I just wondered what you thought about this idea of us as humanity being a bit stuck in adolescence, or perhaps we're even younger, who knows.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, that's beautiful. That makes perfect sense, and I would say that's especially true, not of individual men, but of the dominant culture, which is still dominantly patriarchal. So the modern culture is patriarchal, so it is stuck in a kind of uninitiated masculine identity. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you very much. Nicola, imagine you're come from a slightly different angle.
Yes, I was thank you, Sean. Early on, you very early, you talked about the need for us to evolve organs of perception. And it seems to me that this is key. You spoke about, you referenced Martin Buber, And it seems to me that this is key, that we are moving out of the paradigm of predominantly relating to the world and others and ourselves as it, to thou. And there's someone, I don't know if you know, Marco Pogacnik.
Oh yeah, with
exactly.
the earth acupuncture.
Yeah, well, he started a series as a group, an international group now, doing weekly meditations, but also monthly meditations. And the way it is to part of the work is actually growing our awareness, developing our awareness of nature spirits.
Yes.
So it seems to me that this is really important. Then, but I also have this question: if we are thinking about birthing, then surely we are talking about birthing into the cosmos. So you're talking about friends, talking about extraterrestrial intelligence, etc. We have had this idea of here we are and being just on this planet, and as you say, having these crazy ideas of technological ways to get off the planet. But if we are thinking of this, likening this to a near death, then the birth is an expansion, and that must be to the wider cosmos.
This is so rich, Nicola. God, I wish we had another. We would need hours for all of these questions, really, to do justice to them. Questions and comments. A couple of things. The new organ of perception, and insofar as we're talking about an I-thou relationship, of course, there's nothing new about that, to the extent that human cultures and particularly indigenous cultures, but pre-modern European cultures too, looked upon the earth as ensouled. Of course, many cultures in the past as well as now looked upon other peoples as less than themselves. So there was a tendency to consider one's own ethnic group as being the center of the world. But nevertheless, at least towards the cosmos, their traditional view was more of an I-thou relationship than an I-it one. But what's new in the current moment is that there is a planetary awareness that is truly new, that wasn't the case for our ancient ancestors and traditional indigenous cultures prior to the modern period, where there was no real awareness of the planet as a planet and of the existence of the multiple cultures and continents and so on. That is something new, and that we're needing to humans are needing to develop new organs of perception, which we're doing at many levels with Earth system sciences, with the modelings of the planet, and with the new story that has now a story of the 4.6 billion year history of the planet that we know from its origins as a ball of flaming rock through all of the phases of the evolution of life leading to our moment. So this is new and developing in our own time, which is an opening, as you say, Nicola, to a greater cosmic awareness. And I do take some solace in contemplating my own personal death, as well as the threats to the web of life now, that myself individually and the planet, we are embedded in a greater cosmological process that is also perhaps a deeper spiritual mystery, that the end is not only the end, right? So I do take consolation in that. And I also cherish my beloved and my friends and this place and so on, and this earth and all of its irreplaceable beauty that needs to be guarded as the precious jewel that it is. So it's this paradoxical relationship. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Tuvi, this will have to be the last question. So where are you coming from, as it were?
Well, Thank you very much, Sean, for wonderful presentations and concept, which is wonderful. And I just want to continue a little bit what Nicholas suggests. But what I'm saying, the birth to the cosmos is not to go to another planet. We don't, because planet again in the physical world. I believe in many of the SMN, there is other dimension, the consciousness dimension. So when it's a birth, it's not, we don't have to go to another planet or something else. Here, it's just another level of consciousness that we are developing. But one more point, Sean, I agree with you with everything that you're saying, that you have to do something. And I myself try to do my best together with SMN. And I think to expand consciousness is very important. But there is one point, okay? I felt in you also real fear that you, real anxiety, that you really, and I believe with everything that you mentioned, I'm very optimistic. Because the baby, with all the pressure they've got of the birth, with fear, now he's lonely, yes, but also he does know that there is also the mother, and the mother is not just the planet Earth Gaia, but we're part of larger consciousness. And I can see all this as part of awakening us, and what you can see both with the virus now, with the pandemic, with the climate change, all this is a wake-up call for us, in order to wake up consciousness. But it's not waking because we're going to die soon. It's a wake that we help us, each one of us, and together to upgrade ourselves from consciousness. But on the other hand, I don't have even a tiny fear because I trust the consciousness, not as a human. We are part of something much bigger and clever than us, including even the sunshine. The sunshine is also, you didn't mention, the sunshine is also conscious. And the sunshine also can change the climate here. So even we can see now all the problems that we're creating, but imagine that it's like a mother looking at us. So from this point of view, I don't afraid from any death at all, not to myself, not to humanity, but I agree that you have to do our best from the climate. I'm also don't eat any animals too. All this is part of my life and it's supported, but it's not, we don't have to do it from fear, but in order to go to the next stage, not from fear or anxiety, but exactly from enthusiastic to go to the new life.
Thank you very much, Tubi. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Tubi. I'm glad you are not beset by fear, and I'm grateful that I share your experiences of being held within the unconditional loving embrace of the mother, to whom I pray before I fall asleep every night. And I am sorry for people who do not have this kind of nourishment, spiritual nourishment. At the same time, I am also convinced from my work with Stan and doing deep experiential work, and with Joanna Macy and so on, that at least many of us, perhaps not you, but I need to learn to not be afraid of the fear. So if for those who don't experience the fear, that's great. And if I bow to them, but I do experience these moments of fear. And if I defend against the fear, then I know that can trigger all kinds of other problematic defenses. So so to affirm what you're saying, yeah, and for those who are not as blessed with this total absence of fear, I would encourage you to at least try to work on not being afraid of the fear, because that'll compound.
There's nothing to fear but fear itself. Very famous quote from Franklin D. Roosevelt, which was suggested to him by Napoleon Hill.
Oh,
which
wonderful!
Is very interesting. Yeah, because Napoleon Hill was part of the committee that helped bring that about. I'd just like you to finish, Sean, by saying a few words about Edgar Morin, because I think what he has to say, and from what you say in your book, is so interesting. And you said you spoke to him quite recently, and he's just celebrated his 100th birthday.
That's right.
So could you just say a little bit about Edgar Morin and how he sees our situation? Then I think we'll need to close. Okay. So thank you.
Yeah, well, Edgar is one of the most beautiful souls I've ever known. Certainly one of the most brilliant. You know, he fought in the as a teenager in the resistance against the Nazis, but then, you know, went on to an amazingly generative career. His first book was in 1945, L'an zéro de l'Allemagne, which actually was the basis of a film by that name, Year Zero, Germany, Year Zero. But then went on to write over 60 volumes, including in the last year, his 100th year, he's done 2 books, one on the COVID pandemic and another on lessons from 100 years of life. Okay, so he is the broadest transdisciplinary thinker that I know of, who has invaluable insights into the nature of complexity, which is, so Jung speaks of wholeness, but Jung defines the wholeness of the self, for instance, with the idea of complexio oppositorum, or a weaving together of opposites. This is how Jung describes the self. Well, Edgar Morin has given key insights in how we can think through complexity with the various principles of complexity that he works with. Now, he's looked at our situation for decades. He grew up agnostic, even a kind of atheistic phase, but in his mature years and up to the present, he is radically open to the mystery. He really is situated in a kind of apophatic tradition of realizing the radically uncertain character of our reality on the one hand, but that we find ourselves always face to face with a mystery that has given rise to us and to which we return. So he's very open to that. And a unconditional commitment to life and love, right? And these two as inseparable. And his guiding maxim, ethical maxim, is vivre pour aimer, aimer pour vivre. Live for the sake of love, and love for the sake of life, right? These are his two, his primary sort of ethical imperative that helps guide me through this path of ongoing initiation in my own individual life and our shared collective initiation. Could say more, but yeah, I encourage
yes,
you.
I think maybe we might have a separate session on Edgar Morin, because I think it's so interesting, and it reminded me, these vivre pour aimer, aimer pour vivre. Peter Dunov, Ben Saduno, the great Bulgarian sage, he's the prophet for culture of love, and he said, "Love is life for the whole." Love is life for the whole, and I'm sure that Morin would feel that was very consonant with what he has to say. So Sean, what a tour de force! You've given us really profound as well as wide presentation to reflect on, and already people are saying, can't wait to see the repeat and listen to it more carefully, or not, just get more out of it. And I think the importance of the death rebirth archetype in our own lives, in the cycles that we all go through, I mean, it cannot be overemphasized. And we're always in the process and reflecting in nature. To this afternoon, I was admiring the snowdrops. But the snowdrops will pass and go into the ground, and then out will come the daffodils. And the primroses and the primulas, and then it'll be time for the bluebells. But each season has its own beauty and richness. But the previous part of the previous phase has to disappear in order for the new to arise. And I think that's what that's your message here. And then trust the process. Trust the process in the deep sense of we are part of that one mind, one consciousness that is trying to learn and become aware of itself and of each other.
Beautifully said.
So, Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. Next week, we've got Peter Mansfield talking about how to maintain your health. And then we've got Quantum Think with Diane Collins on the 16th. And then Natalie Zaitouni is going to be talking about a practical seminar on ensoulment. And I think quite a number of you will have heard her over the last couple of weeks. So that's coming up in 2 weeks' time, about this time. So thank you very much, Natalie, as well, for holding the technological fort, as it were. And I think we've got a lot to take away and reflect, and maybe over our meal conversations today, whether it's coming up to mid-morning with you or dinner for us, there's a lot to share. So do share that and share our platform and tell people how interesting these events are, and they should be coming as well. Thank you, Sean.